It's yet another PC classic on Game Boy Works. Not surprisingly, it's time for another vintage computer game conversion for Game Boy. This has proven to be the single most prolific corner of the platform. Sure, everyone knows Game Boy had a ton of puzzlers, but the fact that most of them hailed from personal computers of the early 80s, and even before, doesn't get a lot of play. A lot of vintage PC games showed up on Famicom in its early days, but most of those never reached America, so we kinda missed out on that over here. The same held true for PC Engine, and even Sega's Mark III. Those systems had a preponderance of old computer games in their Japanese libraries, but those of us in the US never really saw much of them. By the time those systems made their way to America, those games were fairly obsolete. Game Boy would really be the last bastion of this trend. Maybe it was the move to 16-bit chips, or maybe by the 90s there were simply wider horizons available for games. But for whatever reason, Nintendo's handheld turned out to be something of a final hurrah for computer games of the previous decade. Boulder Dash is practically the platonic ideal of this trend. Not only is it based on an old PC game, it also never made its way to the US. Licensed from original publisher First Star Games, which still owns the rights to Boulder Dash and still reworks it in various modern permutations, Boulder Dash was initially published in Japan on Game Boy by Victor Interactive in September of 1990. It also made its way to Europe courtesy of Nintendo itself sometime that year, similar to the other Japan and Europe only release we've seen so far, Othello. But Boulder Dash never made its way to American Game Boys, probably because Boulder Dash has never been nearly as big a deal here as it was in Europe. For whatever reason, it's one of those PC games that has an enormous following outside America, but remains fairly mired in obscurity here. Originally created in 1983 by Peter Liepa and Chris Gray, Boulder Dash looks to have been inspired somewhat heavily by Namco's Dig Dug and Universal's Mr. Do. As in those games, you control a guy digging around through the earth, viewed through something of a side-on perspective. While you can move freely in all four directions, Boulder Dash observes the same naive gravity as Dig Dug. When you remove the earth beneath indestructible objects, those objects, usually boulders as hinted at by the game's title, drop freely until they hit the ground again, crushing and destroying any living creature they strike along the way. Boulder Dash ups the ante over Dig Dug though by incorporating a slightly more complex gravity model. Where Dig Dug included a handful of droppable items per stage, Boulder Dash sometimes crams hundreds in, and you can cause more than one item to fall in a single move. In fact, thanks to the cascading property of in-level objects, they often serve to hold one another in place. Remove a boulder to the side or below another, and you might initiate a chain reaction of bricks and diamonds falling into place. In some levels where the developers egregiously abuse this effect, the boulder cascades look almost like someone getting carried away with Skyrim physics mods. I suppose seemingly endless streams of rocks and diamonds were to 1984 as free-flowing wheels of cheese were to 2012. Honestly, it's a pretty impressive effect for a game of its age. I can see the vintage appeal of Boulder Dash. Where many games simply struggled to move a handful of objects around the screen, Boulder Dash could set dozens moving at once, creating rickety death traps that players had to avoid and exploit. The game's PC incarnations often included level editors, so players could concoct their own ridiculous fountains of rocks and diamonds with which to impress themselves and their friends. Sadly, the Game Boy version doesn't include that feature, but even without the customization option, there is a lot of replay value here. Mainly because this game is bone-breakingly difficult. Where Boulder Dash on Game Boy contains only 20 stages, good luck seeing them all. This game is divided into 4 worlds of 5 stages apiece, and you can start with any of those 4 worlds, but getting more than a level or 2 into them is another matter altogether. Compared to the original Boulder Dash, the Game Boy port has been given something of a visual facelift. It's been made cuter and more cartoonish, a practical necessity of sorts because there's no way the ungainly stick figures of the PC original would have flown for Japanese audiences. Each of the 4 worlds has its own theme, from the standard rocks of the first to the more exotic designs of the rest. World 2 features an Antarctic theme with penguins, World 3 a jungle theme with primitive masks and simple huts, and the final world apparently takes place underwater, where you dig through oceans, as one does. Your goal in each world remains the same. You need to collect a predetermined number of diamonds in each stage, avoid being crushed by rocks, and safely reach the exit. All the elements of the original PC game show up here in various forms, including the proliferating ooze that shows up in the ocean world and works as a de facto timer. You need to scramble in order to prevent being blocked off by the ooze's inexorable spread. Another major difference between this game and Dig Dug is that in Boulder Dash, enemies move fast. There's pretty much no outrunning most of them, and they have a tendency to kill you if you stop a space outside their path. While monsters tend to follow predictable routes, they'll generally cling to one wall and move straight ahead, turning only when they reach an obstacle. They often appear in huge numbers and leave you no room for error. Not only that, but you have to be cautious when you crush them with boulders as they explode, damaging everything in the surrounding 8 squares of the screen, which may include you. The explosions can also set off chain reaction landslides just to keep things unpredictable. Success in Boulder Dash generally comes down to a combination of trial and error, careful planning, and breakneck improvisation when everything goes pear-shaped. It is pretty straightforward, all things considered. There's no password for saving progress, but you can continue infinitely, though you're likely to burn through a set of batteries before completing all 20 stages. One other notable detail about Boulder Dash, this port comes to us courtesy of Beam Software, an Australian company that would become one of the Game Boy's development mainstays before being absorbed by Infogrames and later spun off to become Chrome Studios Melbourne. To my knowledge, this marks Beam's first outing on the platform, and while it's not amazing, it does manage to preserve the source material faithfully while allowing for a whole lot of objects to skitter about the screen at once. Also of note is the fact that Beam, on their first effort, got the screen proportions issue right. By default, Boulder Dash gives you chunky, detailed graphics featuring a cute little explorer and the whimsical objects and monsters he has to defend against. But even more so with all those NES to Game Boy conversions that emphasize graphical detail over proper screen object proportions I keep complaining about, Boulder Dash is pretty much unplayable with these graphics. There's so much happening around the screen, and enemies move so quickly and in such huge numbers that the game is literally impossible in the default view. Simply press select, and the view switches to a zoomed out perspective where everything is made tiny and the proportions appear more in line with the PC games. It's still hard as heck, but at least it's manageable. We've seen this trick once or twice on Game Boy before, but it really makes a huge difference here. So kudos to Beam for intuiting this on their first go-round. All in all, Boulder Dash makes for a pretty decent port of vintage PC creation. It's probably not the ideal version of the game, but thanks to its modified visuals and jaunty music, it does stand on its own merits, and at least justifies its own existence. I guess that's somewhat damning the game with faint praise, but honestly you can only ask for so much when it comes to dusty old computer games being repurposed for portable limited consoles. So lower your expectations, and Boulder Dash is great. And next time on Game Boy Works, it's not just an old PC game, it's the oldest.